Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Jenna Johnson-Hanks. I'm the Executive Dean of the College of Letters and Science, and it is my profound honor to welcome you to the Berkeley Writers at Work series. This series this annual lecture began in 1997 as a forum for campus writers of note to discuss their writing process. Berkeley Writers at Work differs from many other forums that we have on this campus in that it focuses not only on what writers write, but on how they write, on the process of writing, on the doing of writing. Today, we have the great pleasure of hearing from Professor Jabari Mahiri, and then he will be in conversation with John Levine. I'm going to introduce first John, and then our speaker for the day. John Levine has a BA from Oberlin College and an MFA in creative writing from San Francisco State University. He has been teaching at Berkeley since 1997 and been a teacher consultant for the Bay Area Writing Project since the year 2000. John is contributor to the book When Challenge Brings Change, How Teacher Breakthroughs Transform the Classroom, forthcoming this November from Columbia University Teacher College Press, as well as other publications. John is a fascinating person who, before becoming an educator, worked in radio and television. An award-winning playwright, John has plays produced and developed throughout the US and internationally. John will have the pleasure of speaking with our primary speaker for today, Professor Jabari Mahiri, who is professor in the Berkeley School of Education and also the William and Mary Jane Brinton Family Chair in Urban Education. He is author of the forthcoming book, Equity Conscious Leaders, Educating for a Just World, and author of the award-winning Deconstructing Race, Multicultural Education Beyond the Colorblind, and several other important titles. Professor Mahiri is editor of The First Year of Teaching, Classroom Research to Improve Student Learning with Sarah Friedman, and What They Don't Learn in School, one of my favorite titles that I've seen in a long time, Literacy in the Lives of Urban Youth. He's also published a children's book, and several of you recently received it, called The Day They Stole the Letter J, and this has just been republished. Professor Mahiri is the recipient of numerous awards that merit his many accomplishments. He is the recipient of the UC Berkeley Chancellor's Award for Advancing Institutional Excellence, the Chancellor's Award for Community Service, the Lee and Henkin Citation for Distinguished Service from the Senate, and the American Education Research Association Division G Outstanding Mentorship Award. Professor Mahiri received his PhD in English from the University of Illinois at Chicago, his MA in Education from Northeastern Illinois University, and his undergraduate degree in English Literature with honors from the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he also received a secondary English credential and taught in the Chicago public schools. Few scholars exemplify the combination of scholarly excellence and important service to our young people and to the society that Professor Mahiri brings us, and we are honored and grateful to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Mahiri.
Good afternoon and welcome. I really appreciate you all coming out this afternoon. I'm honored to be featured in this year's Writers at Work, especially when I saw all of the other featured scholars who stood in this position. Although since COVID, I think this is the first time we've had the opportunity to be in person, so it feels a lot different. It feels very good. Being selected for this event feels similar to being selected for the Chancellor's Award for Advancing Institutional Excellence or being selected to receive the Brinton Family Chair in Urban Teaching. I'd like to think if I could compress my work into 4 words, it would be mitigating hierarchies and complicating binaries. I try to focus on writing and teaching, and often the teaching of writing, that directly acknowledges and decisively builds upon the microcultural identities and affinities of youth and adults in order to contribute to the deconstructing the reductive, color-coded racial categories that sustain hierarchies and binaries and that empower the few and marginalize many. Perhaps the most essential hierarchies and binaries that work simultaneously in this country are the power and privilege polarities that are racially encoded as Black and white. In my doctoral program in English at the Department of, at UIC, I was able to take a number of creative writing classes in addition to those within my program of language, literacy, and rhetoric. And I found out very early that although I was focusing in this particular area of the English department, I had an opportunity to take many creative writing classes. And I found out early on that I wasn't that good at writing creative writing, at least for adults. I do have a children's book. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But and when I thought about why, I thought I haven't had the kind of traumatic life that allows me to dig deep into the well of experience and come up with something interesting. It was like very vanilla, very, things went well, I'm healthy, my family's healthy, I got a good job. So those are not things that are exciting to people who are interested in creative writing, but I did find that writing about the lives of others, using ethnographic techniques, observation, interviewing, reading their documents and trying to get a handle on those people who have had interesting lives was a forte, kind of a creative nonfiction approach to writing. And so if you look at my work, you'll see in digital tools in urban schools and Deconstructing Race, the two most recent books, they basically are attempts to characterize really interesting people who are doing really interesting things and hopefully doing it in a way that does justice to the significance of their work. So today I'll read brief passages from the first book I ever published, The Day They Stole the Letter J, and my first and last scholarly books, Shooting for Excellence, African American and Youth Culture in New Century Schools, and Deconstructing Race, Multicultural Education Beyond the Colorblind. I'm almost sorry that I put that word in there as colorblind because people almost always say colorblind, and it's actually the opposite. So there are many times, I shouldn't say, there aren't that many times when I really felt acknowledged as a writer. This is one of them, believe me. I really feel the honor and privilege of this acknowledgement. But another time when I first felt acknowledged as a writer was when I published The Day They Stole the Letter J. It's older than most of you people in this room. It was published in 1981. And I was the editor for a magazine called Black Book Bulletin, and we had a children's section, and I noticed that there were just not many works on African American and other people of color. So I decided to write a book. And at that time in Chicago in the 70s and going into the 80s, I was a part of a vibrant Black nationalist, African liberation, anti-apartheid set of organizations that were, sort of pretty much activist oriented. We would have Obasi Writers Workshop and Kuumba Theater and a dance theater and AACM, the Association of Creative Musicians, would all come together for Kwanzaa. We'd have 3,000 people at the Kwanzaa ceremony. I say that to say that when this book was published, I was able to leverage a lot of those creative organizations and entities to do the first book talk and actually the publication of the book, the acknowledgement of the publication of the book. It was at the Center for Inner City Studies. And what we did was a drama group dramatized the story. AACM put the musical thing. There's an actual song out called The Day They Stole the Letter J. Muntu Dance Theater danced the trial by fire. And there were 600 people in the auditorium that held 400. And we taped it, and you could hear the kids. They were all standing right at the stage and said, "Woo, wow," seeing all of this activity and animation of the story. And we sold 150 books that first night. But I'm not going to tell this. I'm not going to read much from The Day They Stole the Letter J, but I just want to tell you in 15 seconds the whole story. I just imagined two things. How could I bring my son's life into contact with my life? My son was about 7 or 8 years old. His name was Jelani, and he's in the book. And I always, when I tried to write fiction, I'd take on the pseudonym of Jerome. And I don't know why, but Jerome and Jelani were these two kids, and they were trying to figure out what they wanted to do for the summer, a summer day. They decided to go to old JoJo's barber shop, hear some interesting, exciting stories. And he would tell them stories about trials by fire in Haiti and, Brer Rabbit Tales and Uncle Remus and all of this stuff. And they didn't know it, but he was carving this huge letter J that you see on the cover of the book for them out of what he called his sacred wood. But the problem was that it could not be buried and have its beauty hidden without some strange things happening. And they turned out to try to steal the J because they were going to play a joke on those JoJo. And then they felt like they were like Jesus Christ carrying this big J down the street on their backs. So they decided to bury it in the vacant lot. And everything that began with the letter J disappeared into the world of J, including Johnny and Jerome and old JoJo and Jumbo Jets and Jersey City and the jam that was on peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. It was all gone. So the rest of the story is trying to figure out how to get out of the world of J. So ironically, this was 1981. The book was, it was run in Ebony Jr. There was a radio drama about it. There was a lot of attention called to the work because it was a little bit unusual at that time. Lots of really productive, insightful, culturally competent children's literature out there now. But the thing I want to end with in terms of the day they stole the letter J is I went online about a year ago and tried to buy my own book, and it was $2,500. So I told the publisher, and he was like, this is absurd. So they reprinted the book, and I brought 5 copies to just give away. And I said, how will I decide who to give them to? And the first 5 people who were here were the recipients of their copies of the new version of The Day They Stole the Letter J. So I'll tell a tiny little story. I only want to spend about 10 or 15 minutes talking to you guys, and then I look forward to the conversation with John. But when I first arrived here in 1992, I was actually jointly appointed in the English department in the School of Education. And I had a 1/4 appointment in English and a 3/4 appointment in education. And I had some other job offers. They were all English departments. Some of them were very good. The University of Pittsburgh was supposed to be the best in the country at that time. But my sons, 2 things. My son said, go west, you old man, because they wanted to live in California, say, rather than Pittsburgh or the University of Illinois or Ohio State. So I thought about that, but the real decision was this was the only place that I had an offer in a school of education. And for me, having been an English teacher, that was important. And it ended up being the signature for my entire career, sort of like I think I have been a much better English education professor than I would have been an English professor. But trying to come up with tenure in 2 departments would be like serving 2 masters, And just little by little, I started showing up less and less. And pretty soon I was invisible. It's like, Ralph Ellison and the Invisible Man. People would bump into me, but I wouldn't, call them out on it. I would just continue to meander through the halls of Wheeler and not be seen. But while I was starting off as a professor in 93, 94, I did teach college writing. And that was formative for me. And one of the first classes that I taught, took athletes who had all failed a college writing course in the Bridge program that summer. And I collected them all and put them into one class. And then I taught a similar class of the second semester. So there's an element from Shooting for Excellence that I tried to capture something of what was going on in those 2 classes in college writing. I devoted a chapter to that in this first book that I published called Shooting for Excellence, African American and Youth Culture in New Century Schools. It's dark up here. Okay, so back in the day, and you guys probably, some of you comp people definitely know Mike Rose, but he noted that, what did he note? Okay, Impossible Lies, we operate with inadequate, even damaging notions of what it means to be excellent. I don't want to lose sight of the goals for excellence, but I also want to illuminate alternative paths that permit elbow room for varied cultural and participatory styles, as well as more mediums and strategies for representing knowledge. For me, this line kind of undergirds my approach to teaching college writing. This idea that there are many tributaries, many paths to the writing process. And I think what we as instructors need to be able to do is see ourselves as sort of coaches, almost like teachers as coaches and students as players in a game of learning, and figuring out what are the kinds of things that excite, that motivate young people to write, and then encourage that, support that, potentially guide that so that they achieve some of their own writing goals. So this information from Mike Rose was kind of a guiding light for me in terms of thinking about how to couch my pedagogy with these young students. And I just want to read one thing that the students in their development across this course began to do. I asked them to bring in a piece of writing that they felt that they enjoyed and why, and then to present that to the class. So we had 12 or 13, 14 students, and there was a turn for each student to present their own writing. And what I began to notice is that this other way of approaching curriculum, not what I wanted to teach and learn, but what they were excited about and excited to share, offered what I call little icons. I called it clicking on an icon. There were places in the writing that would talk about staking claim on your own identity. One woman had a sort of a deadbeat dad, and then she realized that she was really more like him than she was like her mom who was criticizing him, but so she had to stake claim. But this notion of staking claim became one of the things that circulated like a meme throughout the entire class, and we began to see essays where other students were struggling with ways that they were attempting to stake claim in their own writing development and their own personal growth and development. And one student in particular, I call him Ray, was conflicted because he was out on Sproul Hall and he saw what he began to call a stentorian man. It was a homeless person who was screaming at the top of his lungs, and it really bothered Ray. And so what Ray eventually did was he wrote about it, but it was like a 1.5-page essay, and he was just, coming down on this homeless man. What was his problem? How was he interrupting everybody else's life? Over time, as the essay continued to go through revisions, Ray began to stake claim on this particular person in terms of seeing something in him that was also reflective of his own sense of himself. And so he was able to transform his way of thinking about this person, the stentorian man. And there were moments in the class where he became the stentorian man. We were reading Color Purple. And I was making the point that, one good thing about this book is that it indicates that there are problems that African-American women have that are just as significant as African-American men, and we need to be aware of that. And Ray took issue with that. He was animated. He just felt that Black men were the most marginalized in the society. He couldn't go along with that. And it's sort of linked into his notion of manhood and eventually to his connection with the stentorian man. So after he revised his ideas about the stentorian man, I just want to read what he wrote in our conclusion. The essay just evolved and became a very powerful piece in terms of the writing. And I had it marked, and the mark fell out. So let me see if I can just find it here. Okay. All right, well, let's see, maybe I have it here. This is really dark up here. Okay, let me just summarize what he had said. As he went through several evolutions and began to actually stake claim on the stentorian man as someone whose identity and positionality had something integral to do with his own existence as an African-American man, this characterization of the stentorian man at the very end of his essay read something like this. When I re-envisioned the stentorian man, I saw him in a dinka with a spear, and the cacophonous sound that he was making became a warrior song. And when I heard this warrior song, I realized it was the voice of Mother Africa calling me home. And so for me, this was really transformation through writing of the young person's perspective on himself and on the world that was purely individual. It could not have happened with another person in exactly the same way. Okay, I'm conscious of sort of going over time a little bit, so I'm going to jump over deconstructing race and read just a section of an essay I think that might have motivated me being able to be selected for this, because we have under the college writing program, and I'm the faculty advisor for our college writing program, a organ called Digital Paper. And they had a theme about 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, on returning. And I thought that that was such a beautiful theme to just think about returning. I remember teaching a whole class on just the word arrival, you know, and we can think about that: arrivals of immigrants, arrivals of new children into your life, arriving into a new university, arriving as an undergraduate here at UC Berkeley. I want to applaud all of you guys who made it. I don't think I would have gotten accepted to Berkeley when I was getting out of high school, because I didn't have the kind of GPA that you guys must have manifested to be here. But I'm going to just read a little bit from this essay that I entitled, to be in link with that theme, The Point of No Return. In June 2023, I will be the same age as my father when he died. In my 20s, my mother often said I was a spitting image of my dad when they got married, right down to the exact height, weight, and color. Making this connection returned her to a more youthful time, but it also made memories of a forced adulthood. A barefoot Cherokee girl sweltering in Arkansas red heat, she was, like Gene Toomer's fern, a growing thing ripened too soon. Her first marriage was like shades of the color purple. She gave birth to my stepsister at 14 and to my stepbrother at 16. Her second marriage to my father and my birth when I was 18 culminated a journey away from the South to the South Side of Chicago. They stayed married and had a life as Pentecostal Christians and gave birth to 5 more siblings. Mom's deja vu takes me back to my 20s too. I look like the man she married, but my life is so different. He was taciturn, except for when reprimanding us. But as a construction worker, he could build a house from the ground up, doing the carpentry, the plumbing, the electrical work, and laying the concrete. Whereas me, I work with words every day. Yet I fancy myself working to build educational institutions also. I remember 14 riding with my dad in a flatbed truck on a trip to Florida to bring the construction company's owner's boat back to Chicago to sail on Lake Michigan during the summer. I remember the cruel looks of white men when we ate breakfast at an Indiana cafe, the back rooms for colored truck drivers when we got further south in Kentucky for lunch, getting sandwiches for dinner from the back door of a restaurant in Georgia, and finally, sleeping on the kitchen floor of a Black man who met us at the Florida shipyard. I remember seeing my dad as powerless and diminished for the first time. In my 20s, in and after college, I tried to contribute to changing these racist conditions. Rather than pursuing a middle-class life as a high school English teacher, I worked for 15 years building Afrocentric schools, adult learning centers, Black publishing houses, and community organizations. I thought my life was qualitatively different, read better, than my father's. Constructivist educational work had not broken my body like construction work had broken his. I ate in any place that I could afford, pretty much any place in the world. I believe Martin Luther King's assertion that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Nearly half a century later, I'm not so sure. Instead of bending toward justice, the US oscillates within the dueling dilemmas that Ibram Kendi described as the undeniable history of anti-racist progress juxtaposed against the undeniable history of racist progress. Clearly, anti-racist progress has not stymied the plethora of disparities that systematic racism has caused for African Americans and others in criminal justice, housing, employment, education, political representation, and the overall indices of health and wealth. I once asked Kendi, if race is socially constructed, can it be deconstructed? After a moment of reflection, he said yes. Can we develop perspectives and practices within societal institutions that create inclusion and belonging beyond essentialized, colorized categories of race that are propagated by white supremacy? Ultimately, our continual return to racist ideas and practices complicates and dissipates other important work that we must do, like mitigating the effects of climate disruptions, wreaking harm on humans, animals, plants, and our habitat. Perhaps the question is, not can race be deconstructed, but can we bend the arc toward our collective long-term interests as a human race before we reach the point of no return? Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And I want to thank the Morrison Library for hosting this event. It's so nice to be back here. We have a long tradition of holding this event in the Morrison. Needless to say, there were a few years there that we weren't meeting in person, and we switched to Zoom, a pale imitation. So it's great to be back. And thank you all for coming out here. And I want to thank you, Jabari, for sharing your writing. I had pages and pages of questions, and then as you were speaking, I have all these notes, other things that I want to ask you about and also mention. Of course, we share in common the Bay Area Writing Project and the National Writing Project as well, but I'm also a big fan of AACM, Mahal Richard Abrams. I've probably heard that song. I mean, I know the book. I'll have to look for the song, The Day They Stole the Letter J. So I believe you are the first writer that we've invited here that has actually written a children's book. So I want to start with that. You told us a little bit about what inspired it, but I'm wondering, do we have some more children's books coming from you? And if so, what would they be about?
Well, I don't want to be facetious, but if you write a book called The Day They Stole the Letter J, it opens an invitation for 25 other books. But I started immediately after because that was for my oldest son. And his name is Jelani. And I began writing a book called Kobe and the Cat. And I wrote it halfway through. And then when I got out here, I've had twin daughters. They're 29 years old right now. One of my daughters, Ayana, and I are still trying to finish Kobe and the Cat. Today is a double honor for me because my oldest granddaughter, who is 19 and who lives in Hungary with her mom, is coming to the Bay Area, and as soon as this is over, I'm going to be zooming to the airport to pick them up, and she's going to be staying with me for, her and her mom will be staying, I'm getting them a house to stay in for two weeks. But she's also a provocative artist, and so she gave me a birthday present that was an art piece that was based on she and I sitting together and watching a Korean drama called It's Okay to Not Be Okay. And this Korean drama woman, the center character was a children's book author. And the love interest had a brother who was a little on the margins, but he was a good artist, but he drew his people with really big heads. So for my birthday, she drew a really big-headed black guy riding a bicycle, which is one of my passions, along the bayfront. And that was, so I want to get her to be the children's book artist for that, and eventually complete the writing with my daughter and with my granddaughter in terms of Kobe and the Cat.
Okay, we'll look for that, Kobe and the Cat. As I said, I've read a number of your shorter works, and of course, these two, The Day They Stole the Letter J and Deconstructing Race. We also had many of our college writing program students read The Point of No Return. So they gave me a lot of questions to ask, so we'll get to those. But for those of you who don't know about this is really talking about a writer's process. A lot of other events, the writer will talk about what he or she or they wrote, but here we really want to zero in on how a writer writes. So if you don't mind, Jabari, I'm going to ask you some questions about your writing process.
Sure.
So once you have an idea, what are the next steps? How do you proceed?
Okay. My idea for the Day They Stole the Letter J was essentially, what would it be like, as I mentioned, to bring my life as a 7-year-old who was raised in the Pentecostal church in conjunction with my son's life, who at that time was 7 years old, who was raised in an Afrocentric school. So we would talk about, we're out of the shoelay this summer and what are we gonna do? And the other kid is talking about, God and all of these kinds of things. So it's kind of fun to bring those lives into contact with each other. But I don't know if other people engage in their writing in this way. For me, it always starts with a title. Almost invariably, I come up with the title first, and I write the book under that title. So Deconstructing Race, I got a really interesting suggestion from a colleague who I admire a lot and who's written like 12 academic books. And she said, the subtitle should be Can Multicultural Education Disrupt White Supremacy? And it would have been like maybe more marketable under that title, but as I thought about it, it would have changed the entire book, because the notion of multicultural education beyond the colorblind was really trying to probe through the lives of 20 informants, 4 in each of the color-coded categories of white, black, I can't even say some of them, right? Brown, we'll leave the other 2 unspoken. And just troubling this notion that there's some way that we can gain a sense of ourselves through these reductive, colorized categories of race. And it always fits for me into the essential binary, of white and black, and then you have some other categories put in between. And I think that that's problematic. We don't live inside of, like I was mentioning here, or in the article, A Point of No Return. My mother is like half Cherokee. If you were to see her, you would not necessarily know that she was not a white person. But that didn't come through in my DNA. And so to just say that I'm, because I look phenotypically black or African-American, that's where my connection to, a sense of ancestry and positionality and identity resides, would be problematic. And I would say for any person in this room, your own background and experiences are just as complicated. So I love to play with titles, and you mentioned the one that I think I like the best, what they don't learn in school, literacy in the lives of urban youth, but digital tools in urban schools. There was a whole year of research looking at teachers trying to learn how to use, this was like in 2000, the research was done in 2007 and 8, but the book came out in 2010. But it just seemed to be an umbrella under which, once I decided it, then I could continue to flesh it out in terms of all of the tentacles that might be associated, with that particular title. I think The Point of No Return is another indication of that.
Absolutely, and in that particular piece, our students remarked on that. They noticed, and it's a short piece, but how it actually returns to the point of no return at the end. So you start with the title. Does the title change as you're writing, or do you pretty much stick to your original title?
It almost never changes. The one time that it did change in the book was the original title I thought of for Digital Tools in Urban Schools was A Second Life of Learning in School. And I was playing with the fact that we were using Second Life, the app, as a way in this school setting that I was observing and actually guiding the professional development for a year. And someone said, technology is changing so fast. By the time this book is published, people might not even know what Second Life is. I thought it was a cool notion of a second life of learning, right? And like, we had the first life and now we have this other opportunity. So I did work on that one and change it to Digital Tools in Urban Schools. But almost invariably, once I get the title, I'm set. And also the title for the chapters.
Wow.
I'm able to imagine, and I don't want to go too far with this, but I'm able to imagine the entire arc of the book in terms of all of the chapters, and I feel like I'm just filling up each of the categories, the buckets that I've created to be, this particular chapter. Every now and then there might be a slight change in chapters, but to just push this a little bit further, and for us as composition teachers, and of course I'm a faculty advisor for the Bay Area Writing Project, so sometimes I'll come and give a little presentation to their Invitational Summer Institute, which brings these amazing teachers in from all over the Bay Area to work with each other for 5 weeks on pedagogy of writing. And I try to push them a little bit. So one time I said, the title of my talk is gonna be In Defense of the 5-Paragraph Essay. And they're like, okay, we're ready. I could see they were like, the knives were out when I got there. But what I did was I took them through a article. I grabbed 6 paragraphs out of a book Future Shock by Alvin Toffler, which I think is an amazing book in terms of like when it came out and projecting the future and thinking about the future. And it was so well written, and it wasn't even like the full essay. I just chose these 6 paragraphs because they allowed me to make a point. And I asked my colleagues in the writing project in the Summer Institute to tell me what the topic sentences were in each of the paragraphs, because I knew that he had distributed them across all of the paragraphs. Sometimes it'd be in the beginning, sometimes it'd be in the middle, sometimes it'd be a transition. The topic sentence for one paragraph would be the transition into another paragraph. So this guy was so sophisticated in weaving these ideas together, and then and they couldn't agree on what the topic sentences were. The paragraphs were no more than 4 or 5 sentences long. So we have these debates then about then what is going on here in terms of really sophisticated writing. And then I said, how did he write this book? It's 400 pages. No, it's 500 pages. And when I decoded it, I realized he had 3 concepts that he was working with. That the future invades the present in 3 worlds. In 3 ways. It's through novelty, new things that exist in the society. It's through diversity, the invention of all these different things. And it's through transience, our increasingly temporary relationship with things. And I realized that he had put an introductory chapter out there that was like 50 pages long, that laid out the terrain, and then he went into novelty, he went into diversity, he went into transience, and then he put another 50-page chapter out there that brought it together, and it was a 5-paragraph essay, writ 500 pages long. But the idea of this is what I'm essentially arguing, is that what is the architecture of your work? And can you create the architecture before, let's use a metaphor of a house, before you bring the furniture in, before you paint the walls? In other words, do you know the basic structure of what it is you're trying to do? And certainly you might see, well, the house needs to be over here rather than over here, there, but the architecture could be imagined and be fairly resilient throughout the entire, and that's what guides me, in the work. I always have a sense of, like, I'm on chapter 3, the second part of chapter 3, where I decided I was going to do this in terms of laying out a theoretical perspective. And so it's like this is what it is. A book can be seen, a nonfiction book. I'm not a fiction person, so I told you that. But a nonfiction book can be seen as a compilation of a bunch of mini essays, many meaning, not many, and M-A-N-Y, but M-I-N-I. Little essays that, you write each one, and you write it from the perspective of understanding how it coheres. Because, when I was in my rhetoric classes, we would argue about the difference between coherence and cohesion, right? But I'm just going to stay with coherence. And argue how, think about how it coheres with the larger theme that you're attempting to push throughout the entire work, whatever length that is. If it's a short piece like Point of No Return, obviously the idea there was to sort of trick people, to have a surprise ending, to build up all of this stuff about the struggle and, me and my father's relationship and my mother's relationship. But the larger issue for us all is, how we're going to solve these climate issues that we're forced to deal with right now.
Right. Well, I'm going to have to talk to my students next week, because I've spent the last 6 weeks trying to move them away from writing the 5-paragraph essay, but I'm going to rethink that, and I'm sure all the writing teachers in here are going to have to rethink that. But to your point, there's something to be said about knowing the lay of the land, if I can put it that way. When you're working with your own students, do you share that process? Do you encourage them to know where things are going, to know the structure? Or is that, and the inverse of that question is, do you also allow, or should we allow, people who don't think that way and are more circuitous?
Yeah. So I have talk about the arc of justice is long, but the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. My arc at this university has been 30 years long, and one of the things I like about it is, starting with college writing and then working in education, we have a program in our School of Education called the Cultural Study of Sports and Education. And we get a lot of athletes who've been phenomenal athletes at UC Berkeley and other places around the country who apply and get into that program. It's a master's degree program. And they remind me of the younger students I work with in college writing as freshmen, having grown up, and now they're adults and they're trying to figure out what are they going to do with their degree and what are they going to do after completing their degree. And so I would teach a course there called research writing, where again, I would collect a lot of the students from our athletes program. It wasn't an athletes program, it was the cultural study of sport program. And this is what I want to say about that. They would often be struggling with writing too. And I think if I have a heuristic, it's about models and about templates. And again, they're trying to write a master's thesis. And again, going back to the 5-paragraph essay, most of research writing for journal publications is very much like a 5-paragraph essay. It has an introduction, it has a literature review, it has a methodology section, it has 1 or 2 or 3 findings chapters, and then it has a discussion conclusion chapter. So I mean, it's not a 5-paragraph essay, but what the fields have done is codified the vessels that you present your research in, and the thing that changes is the liquid that you put into the vessel, so that you might have a very interesting and innovative idea, but believe me, and I learned this with my very first publication with the Journal of Negro Education, I was just out of my English department. I'm like, I'm gonna break this mold, I'm gonna write, like a really creative essay. They have already said they wanted to see where this work was going. The title of my dissertation was Discourse in Sports, African American and Youth Culture Discourse in Sports, Language and Literacy of pre-adolescent African American males in the youth program. And I was like gonna play with some Scottie Pippen images and all of it, and they were like, what is this? They were very kind, but they essentially guided the young scholar into the tradition of scholarship that was gonna be accepted in a rigorous academic journal. So once you learn that, it's sort of like there are constraints, but it's good on both sides of the equation. It's good for the reviewers and the editors because they know what to expect, and they can measure the rigor of the work in terms of how it's operationalized within this structure. But it's also good for the writer because you know what it is you're attempting to do in terms of the structure. So when we talk about, again, me going full circle with my now graduate students who are working on master's degrees, trying to do a master's thesis, that's essentially what I'm trying to teach them, is that structure of a research paper, that you have an introduction, that you have a theorizing section that's a part of your literature review. You have, and it turns on the fulcrum of your methods section. That's what should be the central part of any research paper, because it's going to make the case for the validity of how you collected data, how you analyze data, and how you write up that data to essentially address the original research question. So once they get it, and you know that they begin, because I let them critique each other's paper. Somebody's paper is on, they have to, and somebody else does a critique of someone's paper every week. And over time, you begin to see them using that language of like, well, the problem here is that the way that you've analyzed your data and the findings that you're coming up with don't seem to be directly connected to the research questions that you originally asked. So again, talking about, can we frame something from the very beginning? That's what we do as scholars. We create a couple research questions, 3 research questions, and if we go outside of those boundaries, some editor, some other scholars said, this is where we have to cut this off because you're not being able to justify all of this other data that or analysis or description that you're giving me in relationship to what? The original research question. So I'll just end by saying, for people who are thinking about going for doctorate degrees, I was a little behind the cycle for a number of reasons. And so I was up against a deadline where I had to finish my dissertation and file it, or I was gonna have to sort of reapply again. And I closed the door one summer. I was a high school teacher at the time. So I finished teaching, closed the door. I had what they call a dissertation room, a dissertation office. And for 3 months, I'd already collected and did most of the analysis of my data. For 3 months, I just wrote every day, 8 hours a day. And at the end, I had a completed dissertation. It was 150 pages long. I shouldn't be saying this because people feel like they got to spend a year or 2 years, 3 years writing their dissertation. But it was able to be done in 3 months. Let me say 2 things about this. First is that the title, frame the entire piece, discourse in sports, language styles and literacy practices of African-American youth, et cetera, et cetera. But one research chapter was on their language styles of young people who were in this youth program. The other was on their literacy practices. So again, the title framed the entire work. The other thing is like, when is enough enough? So I got my colleague and good friend, Kim, here. She wrote a 500-page dissertation. And my best friend who stood beside me when we graduated from the University of Illinois, Chicago, had also written a 500-page dissertation. Mine was 150 pages. And I don't know why it was, but there was a moment where we were both defending our dissertations and they were sitting on the table beside each other. And my friend, who's still my good friend now, Juan Guerra up at University of Washington, he was like, hey, Jabari, that's kind of diminutive, my man. You know, it's like, and I was like, yeah, but I'm going to UC Berkeley and you're going to the University of Washington. Why did you write 350 extra pages? So trying to figure out when enough is enough, I think is a key consideration for your own sense of where the work has been done to take, you know, whatever the thematization is full circle.
Okay, well, thank you for that, because if I misstepped on steering my students away from the 5-paragraph essay, what you just said about research and research questions, I agree with everything that he said, and I will share that with my students.
Let me just say,
yeah,
I'm
please.
not pushing the 5-paragraph essay.
No.
I mean, I just wanted to problematize it a little bit, but all of the holistic writing and all of the work that we did, you know, in that college writing program actually argues for just the reverse, and the fact that you all use portfolios as a major way of assessing the quality of the writing of the students by the time they got to the end. And keep in mind that all my 12, 14 students had failed college writing in the bridge program. And so I couldn't even pass them. They had to get through the portfolio process. And that was many different genres and types of writing that they could put in their portfolio. And I really feel proud that every one of those students passed the portfolio process, and then I was able to give them a grade. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. So let's talk a little bit about your process. We know that you come up with your title first, you kind of know the trajectory. Do you write every day?
I wish I wrote every day. God, I need periods. It's almost like I need to be able to clear the calendar and just jump into the writing and have like, I'm in a situation where I teach 2 classes during the summer because we have leadership programs and these people are professionals, and that's an intensive period. So I get to take either a spring or fall semester off each academic year. It's not off. I mean, but I can teach all my other 2 classes in the other semester. So I need at least that time frame of like a semester to really get involved and immersed in the writing before. Now, that's not everybody. I know people who can write every day and, but there is one other aspect where when I'm immersed and I allow it to take over and I don't have a lot of other things pulling. I don't even want to listen to the radio. I don't want to listen to NPR. I don't want the news. I want to be totally focused. But then there's a moment where as you get older, you're going to wake up more during the night than you do right now. I'm just going to leave it at that. But when I wake up, it's a really fertile period because I'll be thinking about whatever I'm working on, and I'm able to write in my head right now. And I can write up to like a paragraph in my head and then go to work and transcribe it out of my brain. You know, it's like the almost exact wordage. Sometimes, and this doesn't go well if you have a partner, by the way, but I'll like have the phone or the computer beside the bed. The idea will be so impressive. I'm living by myself right now, so I don't have that problem. But I'll sometimes write it down on the phone and send myself an email. But if I didn't, I'm able to write up to a paragraph in my head, and sometimes that's some really, really good writing. It's so quiet and no distractions. But I'll also say that my writing process, when I wrote Deconstructing Race, I had that semester-long time, but this was before the pandemic. And so I didn't know it, but the Starbucks near my house opened at 4:30 in the morning. I would get there at 5 or 5:30 every morning. It was sort of like the Army. You know, we get more done by 9 o'clock than most people do all day. But there was a whole community of denizens, you know, like people that you would never see during the rest of the day because they've done all of their work and gone to something else. And we wouldn't bother each other, but we were sort of like, hey, how you doing? Give a nod. And we had our own spaces, somebody would like, be in your space, like, no, that's not gonna work, but they're gonna be gone in an hour, so I'll take it over. And literally I could write from like 5 to about 11 or 12. And that was the kind of continuity of space and time that I needed to really make progress, on the work. And sometimes just in terms of setting goals, I was just like, when I was doing the dissertation, I would say, if I can just turn out 2 pages a day, that will be enough. Now, you guys have to remember, you're so lucky. There's a commercial out about, this girl that she's like 12 years old talking about how lucky these kids are when they have like unlimited internet and it's fast speed and stuff like that. Not in her day, right? I wrote my dissertation on a brother word processor, which is like a box that has a daisy wheel printer and 8 lines of text that's visible. So a part of, I think, how I got trained to like write and have to think about everything is that I could only see 8 lines, but at the same time, if I made a mistake, it took the printer 8 minutes to print a single page. So that I had to like calculate, do all my revising and all of this stuff on the work and be able to like print out a section of a chapter or a whole chapter, and the page numbers had to be on it, chapter by chapter by chapter. Now, I don't know whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, but my dissertation advisor only required a 1-paragraph addition to my entire dissertation. I handed that sucker in. I was sweating bullets because I knew if I had to go back, I wouldn't even have, either I wouldn't have time or just the technology wouldn't allow me to like redo all of this and rejigger the page numbers. She only offered one, she said, give one more theoretical point and put that into, she didn't say a paragraph, but I satisfied it in a paragraph. Wow. Same thing happened with shooting for excellence. This is a good, it's sort of like you can't choose your parents, but you may be able to choose your editors. Because I first submitted the book, I wrote the book, submitted it. I was actually contracted and given $1,000 advance from Routledge. And they had an editor who was sort of like a critical pedagogue, and he didn't understand ethnography. And I really wish I could find a page. I think my daughter threw the paper copies away that this guy had edited. It was abusive. I mean, there were more comments on the first page than I had written on the page in terms of text. And it was like, my focal teacher was doing this and that. He's like, what's a focal teacher? He was just like tearing up everything. So I was under pressure because I was also coming up for tenure and I had, 8 or 10 articles, but I wanted to have the book to sort of seal the deal. You know how all of this is, right? So, so I'm at NCTE, the National Council of Teachers of English, and I'm walking by a table of a colleague of mine. Her name was Jerry Scott, and I said, hey, Jerry, what's up? She said, what's up? I said, I'm just struggling to try to figure out how to deal with this book. I need to get it out by tenure. She said, well, what's the problem? I said, well, these people at Routledge, they don't like it at all. And she said, well, the editor for NCTE Press is right over there. Go talk to him. And I literally went over and said, this is what I'm doing, laid out the book. He said, well, send me the manuscript. And again, the book went through without a single change. And not only that, they said they wanted to bring in Teachers College Press to co-edit, to co-produce it. And so it ended up, the very same text in terms of one audience versus another was just like completely denigrated on the one hand and elevated on the other.
And we tell our students that as well. Different audiences will receive things differently. Exactly. So don't just assume that one person's feedback is etched in stone. So back to Starbucks. What if Starbucks had not opened until 11 a.m.? Would you still be able to put in your 5 hours? And what I'm getting at is there an ideal time, a writing time for you?
There's an ideal time for me in this morning up until, when it's just about this time of day, my mind starts to head toward the hills. I started looking at the Berkeley Hills and how nice it would be to be biking up there or hiking up there. So I feel like justified to do it when I can get, the work done beforehand. But I will say this. I have one of the most beautiful offices in our building. It's up on the 4th floor. I have a spectacular view of the bay. I'm really into aesthetics and everything fits in terms of colors and spatial relationships. But I need to write in public. I need people around me. I don't want to talk to anybody, but that cacophony of sounds and the movement of people going in and out, it actually helps me focus even more on my writing because it's something to sort of block out and focus on. So if it wasn't that public place of Starbucks, I would have to, find a library or find some other space where there are people, like moving around. That helps me, and then also they're busy. Just the idea that they're working and then here I am working, that helps.
What about music? Can you write for music?
I hate music. I tell my daughters this, I'm joking, of course, but they'll be like queuing up a playlist. Dad, have you checked this out? I'm like, no, I hate music. I don't, because music is too seductive, Cacophony is like so generous, like white noise, but music has themes, it has measures, it has movements. The thing I like about, and I mentioned this in Deconstructing Race, I was playing with an unreliable narrator who was the narrator of the prologue of Invisible Man. And of course, he's in a room with 1,369 lights, sipping on some slow gin and puffing on a reefer and listening to What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue, by Louis Armstrong. And then he says, at a point I slipped in between the notes. And he goes down into this rich imaginary world where on different levels, he's seeing different things. He says, in one place, I see a woman who's the color of ivory, who's crying in a voice like my mother in front of men who are bidding on her body. And then he goes a level below and talks about how he sees a preacher preaching on the blackness of blackness. Blackness will make you and it will unmake you. And for me, this idea that there's infinite space between the notes is where I want to be, that interstitial space. But the notes themselves become obtrusive because they're seductive. You have to, you want to follow them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I love music, but I can't write to music.
Yeah.
But a lot of my students do.
Yeah, some people can.
Yeah, and that's their thing. I hesitate to ask this question because I think I know the answer, but have you ever had writer's block?
Not block. I've only had blocks of time that I need to write that I can't get to. But it's never been I have more ideas for things that I would love to write than I know I have time to in this lifetime. I'll have to come back, as a undergraduate to finish up some of the things that I want to write.
So back to putting your teacher's hat on, I assume that some of your graduate students do face writer's block, or there's something that gets in the way.
Yeah.
Can you empathize with that? And I'm sure you can, but how do you advise them?
Yeah. So been here a long time, and also that's the best part of my job is working with graduate students. More than the teaching, more than working with my colleagues, more than doing the research, more than writing grants and getting, significant, we've been very successful in the School of Education, getting a lot of money to do what we want to do. Working with graduate students, and I've actually sat down and wrote with them, where we're at a table. She says she's my daughter, but she's not my daughter, but her name is Dawn Williams. She was pregnant at the time that she was writing her dissertation. And when she would get to these places, in her text, and we're looking at it on a big screen, and I would just sort of offer suggestions for something else that she could think about, something else that she could include, something else that's from her data that might go into this place, or maybe this isn't going down the right road, maybe we need to back up and start over again. But that's a really difficult one. One of my doctoral students was this was back when I was a doctoral student, he was doing this whole dissertation on unblocking blocked writers. And I probably should have read his dissertation to give you more substantive response to your thing, but we do have blocks, and it's really, I don't know, I think it's something psychological going on when a person is blocked.
Yeah, well, I love that idea of sitting down and writing with someone. I'm a big advocate of that. So you mentioned the hills will distract you. Are there other and music? Are there other things that distract you that get in the way of your writing?
The thing that's interesting is I was listening to NPR this morning on getting up, and they said, we got a loneliness problem in the United States. More than 50% of the people in this country say that they're lonely. And I don't want to like beat my own chest, but I'm never lonely. I feel like there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. And so the time that I have alone and to be alone with the text, be alone with ideas, that's just precious. So when I'm saying I'm heading for the hills to ride a bike, that's one of the most creative times, because if you don't try to direct your thoughts and just let the thoughts, your mind take you where it wants to go, some of the most interesting ideas can come up in those sort of free-based times. And so I guess rather than like being blocked, it's sort of like being and opening myself to spaces where inspiration can come. And I'm never not rewarded in terms of like a walk in Tilden someplace, but except that I do, I do have a true love, and that's a golden retriever named Tolman. He's named Tolman Hall after the building that was torn down. So, and I love him because, one, I don't have to take care of him. He has an owner. So when it's time for him to go to the doctor or get his nails cut or get, groomed, all of that's taken care of. And I get Tolman like a granddad, just like he's happy, and we go to the hills, and he's so smart that he doesn't need to be on a leash if we're in a place that they don't have to have a leash. And so we're just out there and enjoying ourselves, and he's, discovering things, and I'm discovering stuff. And then we get in the car and come back together.
Oh, that sounds great. I do want to leave some time for questions from the audience, but before we get to that, I want to ask you about your reading. What do you read? Are there certain genres you read? What are you reading right now?
So unfortunately, I primarily read academic texts, and I'm doing a lot of stuff on race and this and that. Rua Benjamin is somebody that I've been reading lately. In terms of that, I've loved reading, even Kendry, all of the stuff of the 1619 Project. But I would love to, when I'm on a plane, I'll take like a Wired magazine, because it's so different from the genres that I have to read in. And I really get a lot of ideas in terms of like what they think is cutting edge. They say what's wired and what's tired or something like that. So I find if I can get into other genres that are not the area that I'm in, then I can get some inspiration from what other people are thinking about issues in the world beyond the limits of the disciplines that we're working in. I was reading some Bakhtin lately, and I wrote an article on trying to use Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope, time and space continuums, as a metaphor for how you read literary texts, right? And another guy named Gilroy came up with this notion of the ship as a chronotope. It's sort of a replication of space-time relationships of the larger society. It's sort of the moving spaces between the fixed places from which they came, right, and to which they're going. And I tried to make an argument for the classroom as a kind of chronotopical space also, in terms of elements of the larger society are seated in the classroom in interesting kinds of ways that offer, I think, there's always diversity. You could have a classroom that's all African Americans or all European Americans. I feel like it's still maximal diversity, inside that space, and trying to figure out ways to capitalize. I hate to use that word, but to capture that diversity as a way of offering alternative perspectives and alternative ideas for how we think about the world. Because what Bakhtin was saying is that when we write and when we create a text and a genre, what we're actually doing is limiting reality. And I think that we often think of ourselves as writers as like opening up, the possibilities for how we can think about things. But he's actually arguing that every genre actually is not full reality, and it's a constrained version of reality, and that as a consequence, it limits what we can actually think and know about, about the larger universe. So that was interesting to me, because it was the inverse of what I think I'm doing as a writer in terms of bringing in multiple voices, bringing in my own voice. And yet I've made the selection on who those voices are. My voice is limited to the monotones of my own upbringing. So back to your question, trying to find out, reading other genres, I think is a way to sort of escape from the oppressive limitations of the genre that you might be most comfortable working in and get rewarded in for whatever, tenure, promotion, full professor, retirement, et cetera.
I do want to get to questions, but I do want to make one comment. that you said you don't fancy yourself a creative writer, but I want to push back against that because I think, I mean, the things that I've read of yours, there are case studies in here where you evoke characters. I mean, I got a real sense, and I told you this earlier, a real sense of who these people are, and I'm calling them characters, they're real people. But you tell stories. You tell stories about each of these 20 different individuals. So maybe I'm the only one, but I think you're a creative writer.
Oh, well, thank you. I'll just accept that. What I'm saying, though, is I can't invent the character from the ground up. That there are people who have that wellspring of experience or even just vision and insight that they create, like amazing characters, like going back to It's Okay to Not Be Okay. The woman who is a lead character, then this is a Korean drama, but I'm just fascinated by the range of what this woman is, what she represents in terms of her own character. And I couldn't have invented her, And I know somebody's like playing this, but somebody's imagination brought that, that presence into our reality. And I think that that's what I'm saying. If I were to like write about you, then I could be creative. What again, I'm calling creative nonfiction. Come up with ways to pull out of the, data that I might have been able to collect on you through interviews and observations and other kinds of things to create a story, that is something that might be different from the story you would tell about yourself, but might be a story that you would affirm once you see me bringing the authorial intention to that telling. Salman Rushdie was one who talked about we're all this compress of stories, and that in the United States, basically, we're like 325 million stories that, it's a story of our families, it's a story of the country, it's a story of the universe. And I just sort of like that, but at the same time, I think some people can invent those stories out of thin air, and I need a body to start with.
Okay, can we agree that you're a storyteller?
I am a storyteller.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it at that. So I'd like to leave some time for some questions from the audience. And when you ask your questions, we're going to repeat it, so this will be able to be recorded. So questions about anything we've spoken about or anything that's on your mind?
I realize I've only been looking at half of the audience. So.
Yes.
Jabari, I have a question. Have you ever been interviewed about your writing process like this event today, and just like you just so confidently and joyfully talk about what you know about your writing process? And I just wondered if you've had that experience before, or you had any illuminations as you and John were interacting today.
Do you want to repeat that, or do you want me to repeat that?
I'll repeat
Okay.
it. So she's asking, have I been interviewed about my writing process? And then she laid on a lot of laudatory stuff that I won't bore you with, but thank you, Rebecca. So my colleague Kim over here is better than me at writing the stories of others. And she has, 10 books right now. But one of the things that Kim does is she writes with people that she's also wanting to promote and help them tell their stories. And I don't do that. But to answer your question, Kim has interviewed me a couple times, and I keep asking her, why do you want to interview me? I don't have anything interesting to say. But I have been interviewed by Maisha Wynn at Davis, and they're working on a big book about the 60s and 70s and all of the struggle and the people who were in the lead of that community schools, J2 UC in the East and Kalamo Salam down in New Orleans and the Black Collegian and all of that stuff, bringing it together. So maybe it's a question of other people seeing in me the same thing that I see in other people, right? Where I don't necessarily feel I've lived that exciting a life to want to have somebody tell the story about. But if I were to be able to interview you, I could tell a really exciting story about, your life and experiences.
I doubt it, but okay, thank you.
No, I think we all would have that. I really believe if we had an opportunity to, let's say, deconstruct any person in this room, that was sort of the fallacy, because I did do a selective sampling of the people that I wanted. It was sort of like James McPherson. One of the stories that I love is Elbow Room by James McPherson. So he's a Iowa Writers Project professor. But in the story Elbow Room, he talks about this guy, this narrator. The narrator says he left the East Coast and came out West because on the East Coast, they didn't have any more interesting stories to tell. And so he wanted to like get involved with these West Coast people in a struggle, that was going on around a man and a woman, a biracial couple who had a kid that was biracial, but struggling to exist in the world, in terms of the social constraints on being identified in that way. But this idea, but I disagree with him. I love the idea, but I disagree because there's just as many, interesting stories on the West Coast as there are on the East Coast and vice versa. And there's just as many interesting stories in this room as the ones I've told in this book. So if I were to deconstruct my own writing process, it would be like, I should be able to just come up to any person on the street who's willing to be interviewed and begin to, sensitively inquire about their experiences in their life and uncover the different layers of their experience and their existence in such a way that a phenomenal story could be told. And now maybe I'm better as the storyteller, trying to almost operate in that sort of griot tradition of, people who not only like brought the history of an entire culture or tribe to the forefront all the time, but did it in such a dramatic way that it was entirely engaging. So I think if there's a creative part to my process, is trying to find the elements of an individual story that will be able to be engaging because of its uniqueness on the one hand and because of how it fits into a larger pattern of issues that we're attempting to address and deal with on the other hand. There may be a third hand too, but I don't have it.
Yes.
I'm so intrigued with you starting with a title.
Mm.
And I'm wondering, how do you get the title? And when you get that, is there already this sort of developing set of ideas that come with it in a verse? And
Yeah.
then you're like, this is it. This is,
Yeah.
I can fill this title.
Epiphany. Okay, yeah. How do you start with a title? And when you start with that title, does it already come with a core or a set of ideas that are immediately associated with that title? And I think you put your finger on it because the title actually stands for a complex of ideas that are underneath it. I don't use the term the umbrella kind of thing, but it's that metaphor sort of breaks down. But this notion of epiphany, my colleague Erin Murphy Graham, who I co-teach a methodology course with, and she's brilliant, she leads the course, and I'm learning methodology along with her, and our students. But she was talking about, she was at a conference and she heard this person speaking about something that had to do with an area that she was working on, but it was the inverse. And that as this woman began to continue to lay out her premises, she got clearer and clearer on how what she was trying to do was the reverse of that, right? And it was like, whoa. And then she came back, she couldn't wait to sort of talk about how she was motivated because it sort of opened up a window for her into that entire terrain of what she had been struggling with to get it compressed down to what the title was the ignition for. So the book that I'm working on called Equity Conscious Leaders, Educating for a Just World. I should say that there was a change in that title. I really wanted it to be Equity Conscious Leaders Educating for a Shareable World. And I was trying to pull on Toni Morrison's notion of a shareable world, which is what I think we all should be, like moving toward. All of the diversity and stuff, where are the points of synthesis? But but as I started to do the research, because I wanted to do some stuff around climate change and what, school leaders at the district level, at the principal level, teacher leaders needed to be able to do to make people aware of what we needed, how we need to be educated, what we needed to learn in order to be able to interact as a polity in a world that itself is under threat. And that's a consequence, we're under threat. But then as I began to try to do some literature review, there was just nothing there that talked about educational leaders trying to educate for a shareable world or to deal with climate disruption or any of these kind of provocative issues that we all have to face or we're going to reach the point of no return. So then I decided to change it to just world because, one, the word just can make it so broad that I can get some climate change in there and other kind of issues, but it's also the racial issues and other kind of, issues of difference. And I'll just say Our Othering and Belonging Institute, which is on campus, for me has a term that is significant for us all in terms of how we want to move, and it's othering and belonging. But this notion of belonging, that there's something beyond inclusion, there's something beyond diversity, there's something beyond equity that they all may be tributaries toward, but how do we create a world where people feel that they're able to belong in? And so this idea of just, educating for a just world, trying to probe these considerations of belonging, the issues of othering. And the thing I like about othering is it gets below the racial dynamic, because so many issues of othering go on internally within race, internally between genders and gender orientation. So just having a simple template for racial divisions is so problematic, because it's so unrepresentative of all of the ways that we either embrace and accept each other or mitigate and marginalize each other. I don't know if that answered your question. One more question. Okay. Who is it? Somebody from this side? Oh, okay, sir.
Yeah, so I teach in college writing.
Okay.
So.
Thank you for your service.
So one of the questions that I ask my students to address is, why is effective writing important? How is it significant? Especially in a world that's increasingly video-based and visual. I think some students ask, well, what's the point of this? And am I going to actually need it? And one of the things that I'm hoping that they'll see through all the readings and exercises we do and the writing that we do is that it actually changes them as people to be writing, and also changes readers, and also can change society and writing. So I'm just wondering, if I ask you that question, how would you answer?
That's a great point to end on. So I would answer by saying, below the concept of writing is the concept of composition. That when I was cutting my teeth as a composition instructor at the University of Illinois Chicago, even before I came here, when you begin to think about the composing process, you're not limited to its output simply being written text. That all of the things that these other people are interested in producing, and this is what I'm so excited about with younger people, is that that the technology now exists for many very kinds of productions of ideas, productions in different kinds of textual mediums that don't have to just be limited to the written text. So when we begin to compress the notion of how we produce ideas and information into textual mediums, and recognize that underneath all of those textual mediums that are communicating whatever we want them to communicate, that there's a composing process, that when we get them into college writing class, we're facilitating them learning how to engage their own abilities to compose. And maybe they do need to decide, and maybe in college writing, we may need to, as we start thinking about disrupting what's been in existence for like 40 or 50 years, maybe allowing additional textual compositions to emerge that can be equally valued along with the written text. But this is not to denigrate the written text, but I'm just saying that there's something underneath that's much more powerful than the final product, and it's the cognitive, composing. I once had a thing for my college writers, it was like the 7 C's of writing, and it was like, compelling, cogent, comprehensive. I can't even remember all of the C's, concise. But we can also put composing in there as what I think is at the essence of what we're doing. We're teaching people how to compose.
So from the letter J to the letter C, thank you, Professor Jabari Mahiri.